several times today. We're going to lean further into it. It's one of the stories that's fascinating. It captures our attention. It pulls us in closer. There seems to be so many touch points to our faith in it. And this story is focused on these three young Jewish men who were exiled to Babylon. But we don't always tell the rest of the story. When they got there, according to early chapters in Daniel, they were immediately enrolled in a re-education program. They were only three among thousands of the Judeans who were brought there who were immigrations by force to Babylon. The re-education program was designed to transform them from their status as these beleaguered Judean captives into thoroughly modern Babylonian citizens. They were given the opportunity through this program to receive what many people of that ancient civilization longed to attain. It was sort of a quick start for them. Now, a lot of people want status and identity and wealth and purpose and power, and all of this was promised to them if they would make it through this re-education. It was assumed that once re-educated, they would become part of the rich fabric of Babylonian society, joining others from various backgrounds and various languages to form one coherent and productive workforce, all working together. The best of the re-educated Judeans would be given a further exam to see if they were fit for serving in the king's court. To do so, there were some qualifications they had to meet. They had to be people who were without blemish. They were to be, and it specifically says, good looking. They were to be intelligent in every way. They were to be endowed with understanding and discernment. Those chosen to be enrolled in this program in ancient Babylon was essentially their version of GATE. These were the ones who were going to be gifted and talented, and they were going to educate them. And the focus of their advanced studies was the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. You see Chaldeans in your Bible, if you're reading through, starts with a CH. It comes from a letter that doesn't come across well into English. It's... Sounds like you're going to cough up something and spit it, then you're saying it right. I'm not going to say it that way because it's kind of gross. So I'm just going to go with the Chaldeans. If you didn't know, the Chaldeans descended from a man named Chesed, who was the fourth son of Abraham's brother, Nahor. That's found in Genesis 2:22. We covered those stories a long time ago in our series. Chesed was also their term for loving kindness. And I'm sure that all the Chaldeans thought that loving kindness described them and their country pretty well. I mean, who wouldn't like to be known as those who love? Like Abraham's descendants, the descendants of Chesed had become a great nation. And Babylon was their capital city. And since Abraham was originally from Ur, which was only about 150 miles south of Babylon, they probably thought of these Judeans who were entering into their society as sort of like long-lost relatives who had finally returned home. And all they needed to do was to get their feet back on the ground. So among these Judeans who were being re-educated, 4 men stood out above the others. There's Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. Now all those names have meanings in relationship to who they are and to their God. They excelled in their studies. They passed all of their exams with flying colors. They were those guys who had everything going for them. They were the good-looking, smart guys. And upon their graduation, they were given new Chaldean names. Belshazzar, which means one who is protected by Baal. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. They were placed in the king's service. They were told, at least we are told when you read through the whole book of Daniel, that when the king consulted any one of these 4 guys in regarding the matters of wisdom or understanding, the king was always looking for help to make decisions. He found these 4 guys to be 10 times better than all of the magi and the counselors in his whole realm, whom he had previously turned to for advice before these guys showed up. He liked them. They were on target. In my study into the background of today's Bible story, it did make me stop and wonder if this sort of re-education is still being employed today, and I found that it was. As reported by Amnesty International, it's being practiced in China. There's a province in the north of China in which many of the people who now live there adhere to customs and a religion that are thought to be out of sync with what the leaders of China believe it means to be Chinese. These leaders say that they're only trying to turn these people into good citizens, but those who survive the re-education describe it as torture and abuse. Some of them recall being chained to chairs until they give the right answers, of being told repetition of things they have to do and songs they have to sing and pledges they have to make. What they endure is so difficult. There's a high suicide rate among them. And when I read through all the ways it was described, their re-education system sounded pretty draconian to me. Of course, there's always 2 sides to every issue, right? So you should be told that the religion that the Chinese are trying to re-educate these people from is Islam. Many of these people actually traveled from China to the Middle East to fight with ISIS. So the Chinese say that their re-education of these people is an attempt to keep them from becoming terrorists, not only to fight in other places, but not to do that same thing in their own country. These people in that area, that region, only want to speak Arabic. They only want to dress in Arabic ways, and they want to have nothing to do with Chinese culture or to speak Mandarin or even learn it. And they want to follow Sharia law instead of Chinese law. Now, I'm not saying what China is doing and trying to re-educate them is the right thing to do, or how they're going about it is the right way. But I want you to consider, how would it make you feel if a bunch of immigrants came and they wanted to infuse your neck of the woods with a very different religion and a different culture and a different language than your own? What would you do about it? It's a question a lot of people are talking about today. Babylon's solution for the arrival of all these Judeans was to re-educate them. There was probably another side of their story as well, but the Babylonian side isn't preserved for us. What we do is that we know that of those exiles, these 4 sort of rise to the top. What we know is that Belshazzar was one of these 4, and he was the first one to be distinguished. We know him better as Daniel. He had a dilemma, and he began to pray to God. He asked that God help him to interpret a dream and its interpretation that the king of Babylon was troubled over. He did something that no one else was able to do in all of the Babylonian kingdom. The king didn't just want his dream to be interpreted, but he wanted someone to discern what the dream was before interpreting it. It'd be kind of like, hey, I want you to tell me what my dream is. Go. And if you get it wrong, I'm going to put you to death. Well, fear is a strong motivator. All the soothsayers, all of the magi, all of the wise men in the various ways they addressed them and the titles they had, simply said, no, king, you're just simply being unreasonable. You're asking us to do the impossible. Their fear kept them from even trying. So the king said, well, if you don't try, then I'm going to kill all of you. So you can either try and get it wrong and I'll kill you, or you can not try and I'm just going to get all of you because you're just worthless. The king was already putting that plan into motion because no one was trying whenever Belshazzar sought help from his God. He prayed, says, God, you got to give me, you got to help me. You're the one who's given me wisdoms and things. You need to do the impossible. And he steps forward to to interpret the king's dream. And in doing so, with God's help, he saves everyone in that field of service from the king's wrath. We learn in that story how Daniel took no credit for discerning and interpreting that dream, but used it as an opportunity to proclaim that he served a God who can do impossible things. The result was that Daniel was promoted from essentially being a consultant to being the ruler over the city of Babylon. And he quickly appointed his 3 friends to the administration of that same city, while he would be away busy at the king's court. So if you wondered why this is a story about those 3 and not about Daniel, he's off doing something else. So our story today begins when the king of Babylon decided that he has all of these people from all of these backgrounds and all of these different nations, and they've all been re-educated, and he wants to unite them even further. He wants them to all have the same worship, to worship the same God, and worship Him the same way, and do it at the same time. It's His great plan of unification. And so I want you to read with me the scriptures on what His plan really was. And I want you to listen to it for the things that might be different than your remembrance of the story from your childhood. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the, and I probably won't say these words right, satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, and the treasurers, and the judges, and the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come together to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Notice it's just all rulers who are being invited, people of influence. Then the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers and the judges and the magistrates and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men from every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men from every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Now, it seems like everyone complied at first. His work to unify his nation had sort of paid off, you might say. But then we hear the reports start trickling in that the exiled Judeans had not obeyed. Not just the 3 we know about, but none of them around. In particular, the ones who had not obeyed were those who are now administrators over Babylon. The leaders of Babylon are not following the king. When the king hears this news, it says that he was furious, and out of anger he demanded that these 3 re-educated citizens be brought back before him. He was, in his own mind, going to be gracious toward him. So, as been said a couple of times in our service today, he gives them a second chance. And after giving them a second chance, saying, "Hey, you guys need to do this, and I'm going to have the music sound, and you need to bow down," he asks this question: "What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Well, he already knew the answer, didn't he? He knew the answer to his own question. He knew that the God of Daniel, who had interpreted his dream, could do the impossible. He knew that. But dreams are one thing, and fiery furnaces are another. And his rule was based in fear. There are a lot of leaders who lead out of fear. And the fear they lead out of is essentially threatening the other person that if you don't do ultimately what I say, you better beware. Bad things are going to happen. The three that we know refused to bow down as demanded because they feared the only God who could deliver them more than they feared the king who could not. And their faithful obedience to God is still used as an example today because it is not dependent on them being delivered. That's a part of the story you can't miss. They were adamant that it didn't matter whether their God, who could deliver them, chose to do so or not. They knew what their God desired of them, and they were going to be obedient to him, even if it cost them their lives, even if he didn't save them. They made that clear to the king. They wanted him to understand why they were not going to serve him or bow before his golden idol. And just in case you didn't know, just for your information kind of things, their word for worship was also their word for serving and their word for obedience, their word for putting it into practice. Worship was about obedience to God's commands. You obey God, you worship him. And you can only obey, Jesus said, one God. You either love one or you'll hate the other. He said you can either obey God or you can obey mammon. Evidently, following mammon, who is wealth, or following God are two very different things. You can't mix them up. From the king of Babylon's perspective, these three who stood before him had their chance and muffed him. He immediately orders that they be bound up and thrown into the furnace. When I read through the scriptures, I kind of forgot that when they get bound up just like they are. It says that they get bound up their trousers, wearing their coats and their caps, and with their other clothing as well. The fire in the furnace was made extremely hot, as you heard, 7 times hotter. Now, I don't know how they measured that, right? It doesn't tell us, if they had some little thing they could squeeze like you do when you're barbecuing and go like, yep, 7 times hotter, we're ready to go. We don't know. We just know that it was hotter than usual, and it was 7 times hotter than usual. They got it that hot. We are told that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were cast into it. The king was evidently looking into the furnace. He could see what was going on. I don't know how that works or what kind of furnace it was for him to be able to do that. But he can look in, and so can others. And so I want to read with you again from Daniel, the 3rd chapter, starting in verse 24, and listening to what it says and not what we think it says. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded. And he stood up in haste, and he said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of the blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's high officials gathered around them and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of the fire even come upon them, which I think is amazing. You've ever been around a campfire, you smell your clothes for days. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, and as much as there is no other God who is able to deliver them in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego to prosper in the province of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar was definitely changed by seeing the impossible transpire. It was highly improbable that his orders would be defied, but not impossible. It was a certainty that he would carry out his threat of punishment on whoever was so bold. But it was impossible for anyone to survive incineration. People just don't do that. And that's really what should have happened. This is not a fairy tale. This is not some fluke of the laws of nature. It is God doing something that is absolutely impossible. Something completely unbelievable. And that's the whole point of the story. God does impossible things. Things that can't be explained away, no matter how hard you try. It's either God did it or it didn't happen. Yet King Nebuchadnezzar still felt that the best way to motivate someone to do what he wanted them to do was to make them afraid of what he would do to them if they didn't fall in line. He really was a bully. And he's not alone. Many people use fear because it is a reliable motivator. It works most of the time. And they usually kind of do it in secret. They won't necessarily talk about it in a meeting, but they might get with you some other time and say, hey, you better watch out. If you don't line up with me, this is a bad thing going to happen. We often default to fear to motivate us. There was a time when Jesus even taught his disciples that they were to be like these three ancient Judeans, fearing what God can do more than fearing what man can do. He taught them that just before sending them out to preach the good news in the Galilee region. We find that story in Matthew 10:24 and following. It records how Jesus reminded them how he had been treated for proclaiming God's truth about himself, how they had claimed that he was in league with the devil, how he was a blasphemer, how his power came from Satan, how they were secretly plotting to kill him. Jesus told his disciples that if they were going to treat me this way as your teacher, get ready. They're going to treat you that way as well. To ease their fears about how they would be treated, Jesus said, there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be made known. Which sounds like a riddle. That riddle is best explained by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the believers in Corinth. He said that those who oppose the preaching of the gospel are really not going to get away with it in their persecution of those who do preach it, because on the day of judgment, what they do in secret to oppose God and his servants is going to be revealed, and they will be held accountable for it. And that's what Jesus was telling his disciples. Jesus also told them that the things I'm telling you when we're huddled together, when we're in the dark, so to speak, when we're in these small groups and it's just us. When you go out, you're supposed to shout it from the mountaintop. You're supposed to shout it from the rooftops. And yes, expect to be persecuted for it. But you're not to fear, Jesus told them, those who can kill the body but are unable to kill the soul. But you're to fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. We need a do not fear reminder, I think, more than ever. According to the Cato Institute, citing a study done by Open Doors, which is the Christian study group, they have concluded that Christianity is now the most persecuted religion in the world. And you can find lots of documentation on this. But we don't see it as much here. In countries like Afghanistan, openly declaring one's faith in Jesus is a death sentence. Even in religious countries like Nigeria, Christians are targeted by Islamic extremist groups. And here at home, there is a culture that openly resents Christianity and the values that we hold. We're under threat of being canceled or losing jobs for standing on biblical views like marriage and gender. Fear is a strong motivator. I mean, who wants to be persecuted? Who wants to lose their source of income, their livelihood, or to be cut off from friends? Who wants to lose their reputation or even their lives? I mean, wouldn't it just be easier to bow down? But the good news is that love is even greater and its motivation than fear. We are told that it was love that motivated God to send his Son to the world. And because of his love, we are reminded numerous times throughout the New Testament that we can look forward to the day of judgment with confidence. We don't have to fear what God can do or could do, because we have been embraced by his love and his promise of forgiveness, of being adopted into his family, of passing through that time of judgment on to eternal life because of what he has done. Not what he can do, but what he has done. Jesus affirmed that he was sent not to condemn the world, but to save it. So while the beginning of wisdom is, as the Proverbs declare, the fear of the Lord, we progress in our relationship with God from one of fear to one of love. There has to be this growing that goes on. We move beyond the fear of him to the love of him. The Apostle John was so captivated by this idea, he went so far as to say that when you really love God, there's no room left for fearing what he can do, because we are sure of what he has done and will do. That's in 1 John 4, 16 through 21. Love really is stronger motivator than fear. That's why Jesus summed up the law and the prophets as loving God and our neighbor as ourselves. When we follow Jesus, when we follow those kinds of commands, we are going to be known as people who love, not people who create fear. If you're trying to get people to fall in line and follow Jesus by trying to get them to fear, you're going the wrong way. You need to lean in on love. The Apostle John said that love now defines our life because he first loved us. That love was a transforming love. It's a love that changed us and changed our relationship with God from one that was based in this fear of him to one that's based in our love of him. It really is good to be in the hands of a loving God. And I hope that whatever your next step is in following our loving God, that it takes you another step in this pathway of being afraid of him and what he might do, to loving him and looking forward to being in the midst of his love and his care and his provision for us forever. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. I ask the worship team to come forward. And during the song that they sing, I want you to ask yourself, where am I really at in my relationship with God? Is my relationship still based on my afraid of what he's going to do to me, his judgment of me? Or is it one that's based in your love of him, for his forgiveness and his grace and his promise of eternity? Would you please stand?